Mr. Bison Clips! Mr. Bison Clips! Mr. Bison Clips! Mr. Bison Clips!
Hello Year 12 and welcome to this exploration of discovery in Robert Frost's After Apple Picking. The poem is set in the same rural New England area as, for instance, Manning Wall and The Tuft of Flowers, but it's quite a bit darker and different to those poems. It's more like a monologue than some of the other poems, which, as we've discovered before, are more mini plays than individual people thinking. It's also much darker because the mood is quite somber, it's drowsy, it's contemplative because the speaker is almost falling asleep and he's kind of thinking about things, and quite a bit more melancholic. And it explores that heightened sensitivity that we experience just as we're about to drift off to sleep, and whether in this case we're dealing with going to sleep in our bed for the night, or whether we're dealing with more of a memento mori, where we're getting close to death and then we realize all the greatness about being alive is not quite clear in the poem. In terms of actual discovery concepts that you can take from the subject rubric for the area of study, you might want to explore one or two of these. Some of them are much more complex than the other. You could explore the gradual realization of his exhaustion and his fatigue as he's coming to terms with how tired he is. You can look at the contemplation of the new idea of tiring of those things that we love doing the most, which is a bit of a bizarre paradox. The speaker also does consider the idea of aspirations towards perfection, or perfection in imperfection, the fact that maybe the world is perfect because it's not perfect, which is kind of affirming, in his case, an old perspective, but he's looking at it from a new light, and that's represented visually in the poem by the sheet of ice that he uses to look at the world in a different way. The persona realizes that he's not able to continue picking, which is a personal discovery for him, and obviously quite confronting because this is his passion, has clearly been his passion, but now he's done with apple picking. And thereby it also explores his unfulfilled potential. If we then have a look at potential links to the other Frost poems, you could certainly make connections both to The Tuft of Flowers and to Stop Me By Woods, in that there are animals involved in in the experience of the persona. However, what's interesting is both in Tuft with the butterfly and in Stopping By Woods with the horse, the animals are involved in actually helping the persona making their discovery. Whereas here, at the end of After Apple Picking, the woodchuck is absent, and the absence is pointed out, and the speaker wishes that he was there so he could help him describe and define what kind of sleep it is that he's about to experience. You could also look at connections with Tuft of Flowers as in nature, and the way that nature is part of the discovery experience. In this case, it's particularly obvious through the sheet of ice, or the pane of glass, as he describes it, that he picks up, which helps the persona to make his discovery by looking at things from a different perspective. And you could also look at the connection with home burial, in that mortality is present and obviously the core of the poem, particularly in home burial, but also here through the sleep metaphor. But it doesn't provide any answers, which is quite unsettling, quite terrifying for us. It's discussing death and the potential of dying, but it doesn't actually give us any way out of it, or any even assurance of safety on the other side. So the first 6 lines of the poem explore that idea of unfulfillment, of a lack of fulfillment, and thereby a potential for fulfillment and an aspiration to have that completion. But he describes the evening after his last day of apple picking, and there's quite a few images here that hint at this lack of fulfillment. The ladder is pointing towards heaven, so it's not there. There's a barrel that he didn't fill, and there's 2 or 3 apples, or there may be 2 potential apples that he didn't pick. All of those symbols indicating that it's not quite finished. But I am done with apple picking now. That phrase there returns later on in the poem to indicate that realization that he has, that he, well, we use a parallel sentence later on who says, "For I have had too much of apple picking." So we're paralleling those 2 phrases. They sound very similar, just to show the realization that he's come to. It's also interesting to note, and I made a note of that up here, you might want to look up that reference in the Bible in Genesis 28:10-22, which explores Jacob's ladder, that idea of both the aspiration towards heaven, which is partly what Jacob was aspiring to, but also the idea of the holiness of the land, and the idea of that revelation to him was about the space that he was in became a sacred space. So maybe this is also about the kind of the blessing of the orchard and how much this man actually values the orchard. We then proceed into lines 7 and 8, which explore the man's tiredness and how the essence of winter sleep is on the night and he's drowsing off. And we involve the olfactory image of the scent of the apples here to stimulate these memories that he's going to go into, the reverie he's going to go into. And obviously the connotations of essence here is the most refined, and we're not quite sure, it's ambiguous whether he's going into some sort of hibernation like the animals, a winter sleep, or whether he's going into obviously we're exploring mortality. Lines 9-13 then explore this idea of his the morning experience, where he's skimmed a sheet of ice from the drinking trough and held up that pane of ice to look at the world through this pane of glass, and thereby seen the hoary glass. And this again, this pane of glass is quite ambiguous. It's obviously a lens provided by nature for him, which is that connection to tuft of flowers that we talked about before. It also kind of gives that image of a childish filter. A child lifting up a pane of ice and looking at the world through it. I know growing up in Sweden, we tended to do this quite a lot as children, because the world it's a bit like those funny mirrors that you'll get at Luna Park, where everything looks taller and shorter and compressed, and reality becomes surreal. At the same time, for the more adult mind, a sheet of ice is a thing of great beauty. It does give a lot of nuance, a lot of shifts, and it does have a lot of life in it. And looking at the world through a sheet of ice like this does give reality a bit of a facelift as well. But then the image comes to quite an abrupt ending, because it melted and I let it fall and break. But I was well upon my way to sleep before it fell. So he's quickly recovering from this and moving on to his actual dream instead. It's interesting how before it fell is represented in the line break as well. We're getting a very different length in line here. So the word fall kind of is followed by this much shorter line. Frost does that one more time later on when he talks about the 10,000s of apples that he's finding difficult to handle. And again he says, 10,000 apples I couldn't hell, then not let fall for all. And again we do that visual fall in the line break. So following that first fall, we then go into a dreamy sequence up here, which is kind of a predicted dream sequence, because he's not yet asleep, but I could tell what form my dreaming was about to take. And it's interesting here how we're dealing with 3 types of imagery in this description of this dream that he's about to have. We got visual imagery in the apples being magnified. We see every fleck on them, and we get all the blossoms and things. At the same time, we get the tactile imagery of keeps the ache on my foot, keeps the pressure on my foot, and the ladder is swaying. and we get the oral imagery in the rumbling sound. However, we don't have any gustatory imagery, which is kind of ironic, because really, if we're dealing with fruit, the most logical imagery would be gustatory, because you do eat it, you do taste it, but yet it's not there. And maybe that's again hinting at this unfulfillment that the poem is seeking to explore, the idea that things are not finished and complete. But clearly this multi-sensory experience that's being described, that he's about to experience in his dream, is the result of continual work with apples for a very long time. So he's done this obviously and loved it for a long time, but now he's had too much of apple picking. I'm overtired of the great harvest I myself desired. So there's that sense of there was a striving for perfection, for fulfillment, and that's what worn him out. So by doing what he loved the most, he's worn himself out. And then we get the description here of the 10,000 fruit, and there was too much of it, and he just couldn't get around to doing it all. But he had to cherish them all, lift them down, and not let them fall. There is an image here, I think, even though it's not explicit, and I'm not sure if it's very useful for us in terms of our discovery, but there certainly is a hint of a deistic, godlike figure here, a creator god who's really caring for his creations, but is now too tired to continue that labor. And I think that image is emphasized further by the fact that some of the fruit, obviously, that is fallen, becomes bruised, and no matter if we can perceive the damage or not, it's considered of no worth and will be sent to the cider apple heap. And then finally he resigns to sleep, this sleep of mine, whatever sleep it is. Were he not gone, the woodchuck could say whether it's like his long sleep, that's the winter sleep, the hibernation, as is described, as I described, it's coming on, or just some human sleep. So the poem kind of, again, leaves us unfulfilled and lacking a sense of real resolution here, and that's partly because the woodchuck is not here to help us come to our final discovery. So hopefully this rather rapid journey through after apple picking has given you some ideas about how to approach this poem and how potentially you could use it to link up with the other poems and your related text to construct your discovery essay. Best of luck, and obviously, as usual, have you got any questions or items you want to discuss, bring those to class next lesson.